You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining you. It is the 7th of June. And Scott, I'd like to officially welcome you to the settlement era of college sports.
Calling this?
That's what I'm calling it now. I've already texted 3 people that this morning. So
the settlement era. Will there be like appeals era? Are we going to get into the appeals of this era?
We are, I will say, whether we're in the settlement era or some other era, we are always in the billable hours era.
Lawyers are winning. No matter.
So it's fascinating. It really is. The default. Well, we'll just let the lawyers suss this out. Come on, let's just solve problems on our own. We don't need to bring lawyers in at every turn. I know we think we do, and lawyers will tell you every time, well, you need lawyers for this. But as a society, we could at some point just say, lawyers, you're good. Sit this one out. We will take care of this ourselves. But no, of course not, especially not in college and university lifestyles here. So anyway, we are here.
Kids playing basketball get money, but lawyers just reading reviews, that's fine. Anyway.
Yes, we are here to talk about the House settlement, which was finally approved last night around 9 o'clock Eastern time by Claudia Wilken, the presiding judge in this case. I know a ton of you have had questions. I've been promising a recap podcast since March. As soon as this got settled, it's now June, and this goes into effect essentially immediately with the first checks being cut at the beginning of July. So what we're going to do on this show, my plan originally was to have an entire backlog of how did we get here? I think I'm going to do that for episode 2. Instead, I wanted to cover what exactly the settlement is doing. I am very well versed in this simply because this is what I do in my day job. Scott is not as well versed, but a very intelligent man. So he is going to ask questions on behalf of you, the audience, while I try to describe what's going on with all of this. And then at the end, we're going to talk Pacers for about 10 minutes, as we have to talk about Pacers, given what happened in Game 1 and the fact that Game 2 is coming up at the end of this weekend. So before we get to that, first, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. They've been all over.
I wouldn't be shocked if they have a house settlement T-shirt out already.
I'm actually kind of looking for the, can we license Claudia Wilken's likeness?
Surely, my judge, not my judge. Yeah,
right. Something could be done with this, but no house settlement T-shirts yet. But a ton of great stuff for schools all across the country, as well as the Pacers. They've been making some exclusive to the Pacers team store shirts. I missed the one that they made for the last round, which had Boomer in a race car. They've got another one coming out, or I think it's already out for the finals. So you can go down to the Pacers team store and get that. If you use the code HOME23 on their website, you can get 15% off your first order, and that lets them know that we sent you, and we would certainly appreciate that. So again, check out homefieldapparel.com, and be sure to follow them on socials as well. They do an amazing job on Instagram. Actually quoted our friend Emma Watson on Instagram yesterday in relation to Texas winning the softball title. So head over there, follow them on Instagram, follow them on the other social networks. Again, homefieldapparel.com, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. Reminder, folks, we are on YouTube. You can watch this podcast on YouTube and join what is a very nice community of Back Home Network fans and people from across the IU diaspora who are gathering online to watch the podcasts. You can subscribe for free. We got some other stuff coming up with YouTube soon that we're looking forward to working on. That also allows you to essentially, I think, be part of the most vibrant of the comment sections that are going on right now about what we talk about. So go on over, search Back Home Network on YouTube, and subscribe for free. I'll also put it in the Substack newsletter, which you can also subscribe to for free. That gets the podcasts delivered right to your inbox. No having to search on X or Signal or wherever exactly you're. I don't know if people post about podcasting on Signal, but perhaps they should. We are very dangerous, and our listeners.
Blue Sky. Are we still doing Blue Sky, or is
yes,
that over?
We're still doing Blue. We actually do post the podcast on Blue Sky, but wherever you're at, you can get them delivered right to your inbox with the Substack subscription. You can also financially support the podcast, help us keep the lights on, so to speak. $5 a month, $50 a year. We appreciate all the support from all of our paid subscribers, and occasionally you get some VIP videos only for paying subscribers. I was able to recap what happened at the Hoosiers event via that last week, I think it was, and we've got a couple of other of those coming up here in the next couple of weeks. So thank you all for supporting the Back Home Network and specifically for supporting Crimson Cast. All right, Scott, let's dive into things as the House settlement has been approved. What does this mean? What is the House settlement, first of all? So I think it's important that we all start on the same page. Some of you have been following this, some of you have not. Essentially, there were multiple lawsuits that were filed by former athletes about not being allowed to have compensation in that period from 2016 to 2020 prior to NIL payments becoming something that you could do and that were approved essentially nationally. It's a complicated route to get there because there was no law passed that says you can now pay people NIL. It was more the NCAA can no longer keep you from getting paid for NIL because NIL, name, image, and likeness, as we've talked about on this show before, is essentially just your rights of publicity, which everybody has in the United States. It's kind of like when we talk about athlete eligibility or the transfer portal, and we talk about the rules that you have to abide by as athletes at the collegiate level historically, it's not that you are granted those rights. It's that the NCAA is taking those rights away from you specifically, whereas every other student has the right to transfer as many times as they want, things like that. So,
and is that why they're suing the NCAA? Because it's not like the NCAA was going to pay NIL before. But is that, I've always wondered, is that why they're suing the NCAA? Because the NCAA stopped their ability to make money. So it's like you're now liable for the money that could have been made through, Andy Moore or something.
Well, essentially, the idea was we were deprived of economic rights that we should have had by the NCAA and the member conferences. So that was where the lawsuit came from. Because, what's the big difference between what happens in a courtroom in the summer of 2020 or 2021 and now? Or before that, it's essentially, a judge said the way you've been interpreting this is wrong.
Right.
So they set a cutoff date. I mean, because there are athletes who have tried to sue from the 2000s or from the 1990s to say, hey, wait a minute. O'Bannon was a little bit of a different case, but yes. So, but the point remains. So they set a cutoff date. They do this settlement, and essentially the terms of the settlement are as follows. It covers the next 10 years, and it requires the NCAA and the member schools to pay $2.8 billion in back damages to athletes from the era right before NIL was legal. So it's a 10-year, essentially equal payment across that time, about $277 million annually going to this class of athletes that existed prior to these new procedures being put into place. So that's part of the settlement. So that takes care of those folks. There were certain athletes that could opt out of the settlement, but essentially everybody else that wanted to, and it's a number of 80 to 85,000 former college athletes from that period, they stayed in the class of this. So you've got that aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that for the first time, colleges and universities can directly compensate athletes through revenue sharing. And the way that works is that you've got up to 22% of the average revenue among Power 4 schools, and that includes media rights revenue, ticket sales revenue, sponsorship revenue, all the different ways other than donations that athletic departments are able to generate money. You can pay up to 22% of the average number across the Power 4 of those. So to start off with, you're talking about a maximum revenue share number of $20.5 million per school. So IU, for instance, can pay up to $20.5 million, and they will have to pay up to $20.5 million with the idea that that's going to be what Michigan or Ohio State or any of the other teams that you want to compete against are going to be paying. There are going to be some schools that don't pay that full amount. You could see a school say, well, we're not going to pay, or we can't pay the full $20.5 million in rev share, so we might pay $15 million in rev share. But you can go up to that number.
Is that going to be publicly available?
That number is going to be publicly set. So it's at
the end of the year, what schools are not paying the amount?
Well, I'm assuming yes, because, and this is how, if you ever look at a list of coach compensation across the Power Four. All of those are publicly available numbers because these are all public institutions. They are all accountable to open records requests, or most of them. Georgia's trying not to be. You don't see it necessarily at private schools. So you might not know what Northwestern or Vanderbilt or Stanford is electing to pay in this, but you would know what Indiana or Cal or Illinois is paying in this.
It's just more like I could see that being a negative recruiting tactic. Like it's almost like everyone has to pay because you're like Minnesota, you don't want to be at the bottom of a publicly list showing like, oh, we're not sharing as much revenue.
That's true. The flip side is you may have situations where the athletic department literally cannot afford to pay that amount of money. Like, Maryland being a great example of an athletic department that, rather infamously has struggled with finances, which is why they're in the Big Ten in the first place. Allegedly, that's why Kevin Willard left and went and coached at Seton Hall. So who knows? We will have to see how this all plays out. There will also be schools down the list at the lower levels of Power Four or schools in the group of five, or certainly like FCS schools who are going to look at this and say, well, we can either opt in or opt out, but if we opt in, we may be paying a smaller number. So there's a lot of those things that are yet to be played out on all of this. That number is going to go up by an automatic 4% each of the next 2 years. So that'll lead to about $22 million or so, probably for revenue share as a max in 2027 and 2028. The way that splits off is going to be interesting as well. So what's been bandied about up to this point has been that most schools are anticipating paying approximately, on average, 75% of that revenue share to football, which would mean if you take 75% of 20.5 million, that's about $15.4 million in rev share that would be devoted specifically to football. On average, you're talking about roughly 15% of rev share money going to men's basketball, which equates to about a little over 3 million, about 3.1 million. 5% on average to women's basketball, which is about 1 million. And then that same number, 5%, about 1 million for all the other sports combined for an athletic department. So what that's going to mean for this upcoming season, authorized revenue sharing for football is probably going to be somewhere between 13 and 16 million. However, we have heard, I think there was a quote from Pete Thamel, the ESPN journalist, saying that you could see some schools paying up to 90% of their deals in football specifically. So that could leave only 10% for all the other sports, including men's basketball combined. So you'd be talking about roughly 18 million in some of those spots. So I'm just laying all these things out at first, so we're all on the same page with things. So that's revenue share, and I think it's important for people to understand like what revenue sharing is. It's coming directly out of the athletic budget, which is going to have some knock-on effects in terms of how the athletic department pays for everything else. Because even though there's a ton of money in college sports, as we've said many times on this show, one of the problems you run into in college sports is that they're not set up as profit centers. They're not set up as businesses. Right. They're set up as...
They can't have reserves. So year in, year out, they should every year have a zero rollover budget.
Right. So you increase your revenue, you spend that money. And in the 2000s and 2010s, and even a little bit of this decade, a lot of that's been facilities. Oh, we're going to build a new field hockey facility or whatever. You're going to get donors to help underpin that, but still, you're spending money on that. You've had these huge increased numbers of enforcement staff that have been added. You've added practice facilities. You've added all of these things. You've increased the amount of money you're paying to coaches by an insane amount of money because that's all coming out of your budget, and you couldn't spend it on the athletes. So that's how a college football coach is making. I mean, Kurt Cignetti's making $8 million plus a year this upcoming year, and I think he's only like 15th in the country in total compensation package for football coaches. And you look across at basketball coaches have gone up to the $4, $5, $6 million range on average with the Power Four. So strength and conditioning coaches are making nearly $1 million in some cases. Go ahead. What?
I don't mean to get ahead of ourselves, and stop me if we are. Is there any possibility that schools could be able to be open to renegotiate those contracts? Because I mean, they signed them in a time when they had to spend all of their money. So now if, they have to spend, if IU has to spend an extra $200 million, is there a way you can be like, hey, had we known we had to spend $200 million, we couldn't have offered Cignetti or any coach, random coach this much money. Is there any way they can get out of those contracts based on this settlement or not?
I would sincerely doubt it.
Out, but just like
I don't see any. I mean, we've seen a couple of cases where coaches have said that they're going to donate part of their money back to the NIL collective.
Happening around, yeah.
But in this case, no. Now, I do think that it will have a depressing effect on the coach marketplace, and it should. It should.
Yeah.
I mean, every time I say this, I come across as like a bitter academic, and I'm not. I'm just making an observation here. The pay for professors at the college level has gone up, I think, on an average like 3% or 4% since the year 2000. The increase in pay for college head coaches and assistant coaches, especially in football, has gone up by, I think it's like 400% or something like that. Like, it's an insane delta between those two numbers. So I do think that the next round of contracts, I do think you're going to be having some schools saying, we are not going to pay this amount of money for college coaches. On the other hand, you might, because as we've seen in the business world, if you look
at other places,
if you look at coach compensation as kind of a proxy for CEO compensation, businesses cannot help themselves with a lot of what they pay these CEOs. It's pretty wild. So you may run into a similar thing with college coaching, but we don't know. Like, a lot of it's going to depend on how that gets metered out. But no, I don't see any coach contracts being rolled back anytime soon or renegotiated. Nobody's that generous, unfortunately. So going back to the point I was making before, how's all this being administered? So there's a new thing that's been created called the Collegiate Sports Commission. What is the Collegiate Sports Commission? Well,
I'm going to go with the NIL, like Collegiate Sports Go.
Well, no, they're not doing that. But that is funny. I appreciate you saying that because we're going to get to that in a second. That was pretty ridiculous. The Collegiate Sports Commission is this new entity that was developed by the Power Four. There's a couple of non-Power Four schools, I think, in the midst. But the idea behind the Collegiate Sports Commission, I'm just quoting right off of their website here, which is at, helpfully, collegiatesportscommission.org, if you want to go check it out for yourself. The Collegiate Sports Commission is the organization overseeing the new system that allows schools to share revenue directly with student athletes and ensures that NIL deals made with student athletes are fair and comply with the rules. The Collegiate Sports Commission will facilitate more opportunities than ever before for athletes to benefit from their participation in intercollegiate athletics and will bring much needed stability and structure to college sports. So this is an interesting body because it is not part of the NCAA. It's an independent entity from the NCAA that collaborates on overseeing compliance with the new NCAA rules created in connection with the settlement around roster limits, which we'll get to in a minute, revenue sharing, and student athlete NIL deals. The NCAA is responsible for enforcement of matters such as rules of the game, academic and athletic eligibility, and sports betting. So there's a clear distinction here. This commission is intended to be essentially the police of all of this. They announced that they were hiring a commissioner. This news just cracked relatively recently, and they are hiring Brian Seeley as their inaugural CEO. Brian Seeley spent several years as the executive vice president for legal and operations at Major League Baseball. So this is the type of person they've decided that they want to bring in to oversee this entire process.
Before that, he was the U.S. assistant attorney in charge of like high-level white-collar crimes and counsel the U.S. Senate, and
very, very apropos, I would say. So it's important to draw a distinction between revenue sharing and NIL. Revenue sharing is money that's coming directly out of the athletic budgets, and it is being paid directly to athletes. There is no third party involved. So this is the schools directly paying their athletes X amount of dollars. And, there's nothing specific about how that has to be done, either overall, sport by sport, or individually, school by school, which is going to mean a bunch of things in terms of now athletic departments really have to run their roster business like a business. They're not going to be able to have under the table payments and things like that, or trying to coordinate with an NIL collective on X, Y, or Z. So that's still going to happen in some cases. But the idea here is ultimately we want to take the money that's being paid to athletes and centralize it and have it controlled by the schools. So that's That's where that's coming from to start with. And NIL still is around. But the way that the NCAA and the conferences have decided to try to attack the NIL issue is by contracting with a company, Deloitte in this case, to create an NIL clearinghouse, which Scott just labeled earlier, NIL Go.
I didn't label it. I said what its label was, not like I created
Fair
it.
enough.
Yeah.
But the idea behind the NIL clearinghouse, which is connected to the Collegiate Sports Commission, is that any third-party deal, so any money that you're making that is not coming out of that revenue sharing from the school that you're playing for, anything over $600 or $600 or more technically, has to be approved or is supposed to be approved by this clearinghouse, NIL Go, which is run through Deloitte. Now, it's interesting because we've looked at this. There were a lot of questions about whether this aspect of the settlement was even going to be approved. Some people thought perhaps the judge would fail in that, would not fail, but would say that that's not allowable. But it looks like she has indeed said that it is allowable. The judge claimed that the third-party NIL provisions of the settlement had not been proven to be anti-competitive in the marketplace. So she's going to let those proceed, but they're not indemnified by any sort of protection in terms of like not being sued. This is interesting because like the NCAA in their victory lap press conference, once this thing was approved, essentially seemed to think that they were indemnified from lawsuits on that front for 10 years, which is not the case. Any deal signed NIL-wise before July 1st is not subject to the clearinghouse. So that's why we talked in April and then again in early May about this idea that teams were trying to get NIL deals set up before this deadline because they are not subject to these reporting rules that this clearinghouse has put into place. You are probably going to see this be the first thing that's openly challenged because there's a couple of different things that are going on in this mix. Right now, there's no clear accounting for these third-party NIL deals. There's a statement that says you have to report these things that are $600 or more to this NIL clearinghouse. How would they know? Like, these are oftentimes private deals that are being cut. So I'm very curious to see exactly how the Collegiate Sports Commission and how the NIL Clearinghouse is really going to be able to attack that particular issue. Because how do you compel private parties from dealing with each other? Yes, if you get caught, you could get in trouble. But that's not too different from the old days where you couldn't pay anybody anything. But many cases saw us not having situations where anybody knew the payments were officially taking place in the first place. So I am a little bit suspicious about how all that is going to meter out.
Well, and I wonder what is, I mean, you've talked about in a previous pod, like NIL Go, what is their power if they catch somebody? I mean, so, it's between, you have two parties who are, it's not against the law to have advertisers and to advertise for a product or to have a deal where somebody pays you for appearances or whatnot. They're not the NCAA, so they can't take away eligibility. Like what?
Well, okay.
What can they do? Well,
so this is interesting because if you go back and you look at how they've tried to structure this, the way that it's supposed to work is as follows. And I'm not saying that it will actually work this way, but this is what they've come up with. So the College Sports Commission will have the CEO, who we now know, plus a head investigator for enforcement matters. This entity is charged with assuring that schools remain under the rev share cap and that third-party NIL deals with athletes are not phony booster-backed deals, which is what we've seen in a lot of cases over the last 4 years. An enforcement staff is expected to be hired to investigate and enforce, on behalf of the NCAA, rules related to cap circumvention, tampering, etc., and are charged with levying stiff penalties. Violators may be subject to multi-game coach suspensions, reductions in a school's revenue share pool, as well as reductions in allowing transfers and significant school fines. All of this coming out of a Ross Dellinger article, which I'm quoting, that was put out today.
So the CSC is the enforcement arm of NIL Go also?
That is what it appears to be.
Okay.
Now,
and they work with the NCAA somehow to levy those coach, because it's also, I mean, you and I could be like, hey, we're imposing a 2-game ban on Michigan's football coach. Like nothing's going to happen.
And the mechanism, I mean, there's a lot of different elements to this mechanism that I think until we actually see the rubber hit the road and until they survive some court challenges, I think you can view with some skepticism. And I might get to a little bit of that later on in the show. But continuing to quote from this Dellinger piece, Deloitte is expected to approve or disapprove NIL deals submitted in as little as 1 day. Athletes, if they submit a deal that is rejected, or then they can resubmit it with alterations suggested by the clearinghouse. And the example that was given here was they might say, okay, this athlete got a $100,000 deal between themselves and this third party, and that's not fair market value, but $50,000 would be. So if you resubmit the deal with that number, we'll approve the deal. If the deal gets rejected again, then it gets referred to the enforcement staff and then processed through an appeals system via court-overseen arbitration. Arbitration rulings are expected within 45 days, according to the settlement. Athletes who lose arbitration cases and still accept compensation in the rejected deal are deemed ineligible. So,
but they're deemed ineligible by the CSC.
But the NCAA basically processes the ineligibility.
Got it.
So that's the system and how it's supposed to work. Now, will that actually...
Those are really quick turnaround times.
They are. And when you talk about the sheer volume of deals and athletes that are taking place within this spectrum, it seems a little pie in the sky. Not to mention the whole idea of establishing fair market value and essentially using this commission as an arbiter of that is probably going to come under assault, because I think you can certainly see circumstances where athletes sue if they don't get the NIL deal that they are promised, with the argument that how could this commission accurately judge what fair market value is? And you can certainly say, oh, we're looking at X, Y, and Z in the marketplace, but there's a lot of things with intrinsic value, media modality, things like that. I don't know how this is going to work out on that front. I'm very curious to see how it goes within all of that. Now, one of the things about this is schools are being asked to sign this thing where they're going to abide by the rules, and where these rules would circumvent anything that a state has passed that would make it easy for a school to circumvent the rules. So, for instance, the state of Tennessee just passed a law saying that their state schools are not subject to these rules and the enforcement of them. What basically this commission is saying is all these schools have to sign this agreement that they will abide.
We agree with CSC, not the state.
And if you don't, then you don't get to participate in your conference, and you don't get to participate in rev share and all of these things. Now, will we see lawsuits there? Possibly, yes. This is why all of this just kind of feels like a head scratcher. It does require all of the schools to voluntarily submit to this larger structure and these rules, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm wondering whether it's a thing that's going to actually happen. And that's going to be the big question mark as we move into this next phase.
Well, it's something you and I have talked about for a while. I think a lot of people have. It's like this, in theory, this is kind of what college sports needs. They need all of the schools to band together. And some people are going to they need to go as a collective, as a group. And that means that some people take a little bit less, and it's got a little bit around the edges. They've never worked that way in 140 years. Like, they've all been their own little pirate ships out there fighting, and then the conference is their own pirate ship. So I'm with you, very skeptical, because if you're, we'll just use them as example, the University of Tennessee, it's like, well, hey, we have this exemption that, that Alabama doesn't. Our state is helping us do this. Like, why are we just going to give up this trump card no, like, screw that. Like, we're going for it. Like, we're not in it with Alabama. We are not in partnership with them. And it just seems very atypical of what they've been doing for 100 years.
Well, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, because there was a really interesting Dan Wolken piece that hit at that particular thing, but I want to wait till I get through the rest of it before we really dive into that aspect. But it's a really good point. So we can delve into all of the specifics of the enforcement later, and we'll have some other guests on the show to kind of talk through that. But the other thing that I think is worth noting, a couple of things. So Pete Nakos from On3 had an article about everything today, and one of the quotes out of that article about the approval of the settlement reiterated something that we heard back in, I think, a couple of weeks ago, where Deloitte officials had gone to the ACC spring meetings and had told them that the clearinghouse would have denied 70% of past deals from NIL collectives, but would have approved 90% of past deals from public companies. And so this is, again, where, a lot of what this appears to be predicated on from an economic perspective, from a legal perspective, is this idea that we're fine if Chipotle or Everbowl or whoever wants to come in and sign a deal with an athlete because there's a commercial purpose there, there's advertising, there's social media. What we're not okay with is these huge deals between private entities or between money being donated specifically just to give money to athletes. We're not okay with that. Now, that's going to be the big question mark about what holds up in court and how you could possibly enforce on a granular level the kinds of deals that I could easily see schools and donors coming up with to try to skirt these. I mean, because most donors have business. How do you meter out what a private business is doing in terms of their willingness to pay somebody on their behalf? Right. There's also the back end aspect where we know we've had several stories about NIL deals being struck with athletes who then didn't abide by any of the rules that made it technically approvable by NIL. Like, okay, we're going to sign you to this $1 million deal for the out of the NIL collective for Miami. Let's use an example. But you have to make 20 public appearances, and then the athlete makes one in the whole time. Well, it doesn't void the deal the way that things are written up now. Now, that's made NIL collectives mad. It's made schools mad. But what are you going to do? How do you enforce that once you've gotten the season out of them at that point? If you're the school, I mean, what are you going to do? Take the money back? That's not ever going to stand up in court. So there's all of these complications that have not been delved into. They're going to have to get hashed out again by lawyers, as we talked about. But this is the system that we've currently seen set up. Now, the other thing I think is worth noting is that ultimately this automatically separates what schools at different stations financially in terms of their alumni bases are actually going to be able to do. And this is where this may end up being the thing that hurts any school that isn't willing to not just go full into revenue sharing, but also doesn't have well-heeled boosters or companies that are tied to boosters. So this was from Pete Thamel today. I'm just going to quote this because I think he does a good job of summing it up. You're not supposed to promise it up front, but Texas is going to have more outside NIL available than Louisiana Monroe as it goes. So how these deals are accepted through this NIL clearinghouse, basically that is going to be an open question because you're just going to have some haves and have-nots. The old NCAA enforcement model as we knew it is primarily dead. NCAA enforcement still exists for academic cases and fairness of the game cases. But there's a whole new sheriff in town. His name is Brian Seeley. He comes over from Major League Baseball, and he was hired formally within 3 hours of the settlement coming. His job and the role of his organization is ultimately going to determine your question of whether this evens the playing field or the built-in advantages that schools have still exist. And this is where, if you're trying to look at this from this perspective of Indiana, this is where Indiana's willingness to play according to the financial structures of things, that Ohio State or Michigan are doing is critical. But even then, IU doesn't have the same amount of money that those schools have at their disposal. And so the question ends up becoming, well, what are the mechanisms to try to keep it relatively even? There was a really good series of tweets by Stuart Mandel that occurred over the course of, actually, I think he tweeted these this morning. And he said, it's somewhat poetic. The House settlement got approved during Game 3 of the Women's College World Series, where $1 million pitcher Najeri Kennedy nearly led Texas Tech to an improbable national title. Because the purpose of the new Deloitte NIL Clearinghouse is to stamp out collectives like Texas Tech. NIL/portal has been the rare development that broke the, quote, usual suspects stranglehold on top talent in the NCAA. The top portal quarterback, Darian Mensah, chose Duke. Cam Ward and Carson Beck chose Miami, who hasn't won in 20-plus years. Five-star hoops recruit went to BYU. And Kennedy didn't pick Oklahoma, who's got the most money in softball NIL. Nick Saban and others love to say we need NIL reform to, quote, level the playing field. But the playing field has never been level. The schools with the most history and biggest fan bases always get the best players. So they hate someone like Texas Tech using NIL money to invade their turf. That's exactly the kind of spot IU and other schools like IU find themselves in. And that's where on the one hand, revenue sharing is good because it does even the playing field a little bit, and that you're going to at least have a minimum amount. But we've got Curt Cignetti quoted earlier this spring saying that right now there are schools that are spending upwards of $40 million on their football roster, just the football roster. And as he said, our little pot of gold at Indiana is pretty nice, but we're not at 40 million or 30 million or even 25 million. So, you're talking about a system that's got essentially a hard cap with revenue sharing, but NIL money, outside money, is a whole nother order, and there's probably not a good way to enforce that because there are just going to be schools like the Texases and Ohio States who are going to be able to figure out a way to marshal a lot of money through that mechanism and use that to reestablish the advantage in the playing field that they lost to some degree over these last 5 years when everybody was essentially dealing with an uncertain financial future.
Yeah, I mean, as just a novice in this, I think this is the dumbest argument when I hear it, that we need to level the playing field or there's going to be winners and losers. It's like this, there's no world where there was never winners and losers in college sports. Like there was always like that quote, there was always teams that had advantages. And, it's like you got to solve one problem at a time. And the first problem you need to solve is like paying athletes. And that's the first step. We'll talk about the Pacers, like I'm a Pacers fan, there's no conduit where I can give them more money and they can spend more money on Tyrese Halliburton. Like they have a cap and they do, but that sport has been set up that way because it's a group collective. Like the idea that you're going to also have all this seismic change and then have everybody be have just a level playing field. To me, it's like, it's fanciful. It's not what college sports has ever been. And it's also like, you're trying to solve too many problems. So I bristle when I hear people talk about that because it's like, that's not something we need to solve. From an IU perspective, I do wonder if when Cignetti talks about it, that's him telling the university, like, can we get ourselves to 40 million?
Well, no, it is. But it's also now, I think, going to be really interesting because a lot of other factors are going to play in to the money people are willing to give and what the return on investment is. And it's one of two things. I mean, how effective will these neutral arbitration processes be on these NIL deals? I don't think anybody really knows. Is it possible that schools will just voluntarily say, sure, we're going to submit to these and we're going to abide by those decisions? I don't know. I mean, when you look at professional sports thrive on everybody playing by the same rules, or there being a system where if you decide to go beyond the rules, you have to pay back. That's what the luxury tax is all about in the NBA. It's what the second apron stuff is about in the NBA. It's what you see in Major League Baseball, where you have a luxury tax above a certain threshold. And some teams are just willing to pay it. Now, they have some competitive issues there, and that's what I do worry about. This is not like that. This is essentially saying, well, we're not allowed to adjudge these payments, and you won't be able to unless you have true collective bargaining, which is not in this NIL settlement. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Like, there is no union for players, so there's no collective bargaining. This is just the school saying, we're going to voluntarily pay you $20.5 million. We're expecting you to submit your essentially private sector business dealings to this commission to be approved or denied if you want to take part in being on the roster of a team.
Because it feels like the next piece for a player is to say, like, we'll give you that info if we also get a say in what the rev share number is.
I mean, there's a lot to it. It's an interesting thing because even the rev share number, if you look at, and this is where the NCAA and the conferences continually argue that they aren't a pro business, they're not pro sports, even though they clearly look like they are. But if you look across the board at the revenue split in professional sports, it's about 50-50.
Yeah, basketball is like 49. I mean, players get like 49% of the money.
And that's down. Like back in the, about 25 years ago, I think the NFL split was like 57%. I think the NBA split was like going to the players, like more money was going to the players. That's gradually been whittled down over time, but it's still a sizable amount. And here you're talking about 22% of the average.
Right.
And the average is an important thing because, as we've talked about, like Ohio State has an athletics budget that is literally double what Indiana's is. So Ohio State's not paying 22% of their budget. They're paying 22% of the average budget, which is they have more room to deal with that than Indiana does. Because 22% of 150 million is half of the percentage of 22% of 300 million. Right. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing I think is important to keep in mind in all of this, from an enforcement perspective and from a voluntary perspective, is this idea that, something you said earlier, and I guess we can just jump to it now before we get to like roster limits and other items. From that Dan Wolken piece that I was talking about, I'll put all these in the Substack as well if people want to read them. He had an interesting passage talking about the very thing that you described. These are not partners in business. These are schools and universities that compete in everything, even conference mates like the Big Ten, which, professors in the Big Ten collaborate on research. We've heard about that for years, and that's true, they do. But in every other aspect, these are schools in direct competition with each other for donors. They're in direct competition with each other for attendance of students and the best students and things like that. So in Wolken's piece, and I'm quoting here, in the NFL or the NBA, for instance, team owners are highly competitive, but fundamentally understand that they are business partners more than competitors, driving long-term decision-making that works to everyone's benefit. College sports has never had that mentality. Schools and conferences attempt to work together when necessary, but they ultimately see each other as adversaries to take advantage of and exert leverage on when it suits their immediate interests. It's a theme we've seen over and over again in everything from conference realignment to how they reacted to COVID in 2020, Big Ten, to the future structure of the college football playoff. They are forever probing for the smallest competitive advantage, pushing the limits of the rules and crying foul when the NCAA comes in and investigates. And so ultimately, it's like, this is going to require an absolute, almost like soul exchange of how college sports has operated historically, where, as we've said many times, and if you've ever taken a lecture from me on college sports and you go back to the history of it, the rules that the NCAA sets into place are not this arbitrary thing that somebody living in a palace in the sky is deciding on. These are rules that the schools have agreed to voluntarily. They voluntarily said, we're part of college sports. We're going to vote for these rules. We're part of these rules. Every time over the last 30 years, you've seen a major organization or institution run afoul of these rules. Not almost every time. Indiana being a notable exception to these, because as we've talked about before, IU in the late 2000s was far more obsessed with showing how much they would abide by the rules once they'd broken them than they were about like actually having a good basketball program. But North Carolina breaks every standard and rule about academic cheating and violating their own accreditation guidelines, and then essentially forces the NCAA into a spot where they don't punish them in any meaningful way, claiming that, these were things available to everybody. We've seen recruiting violations where teams have essentially gone and said, we're not going to serve this punishment. We're just going to go ahead and do what we do, and we're going to threaten the NCAA to sue us. And if it's a big enough school, the NCAA has generally backed down because they can't win in court because their rules are arbitrary. What you're going to see now is a situation where schools are being told, here's the rules. Here's how much money you can pay directly. Here's what your NIL collectives and outside entities can do with NIL. You have to abide by these and agree that you're not going to break the rules or probe for gray areas solely to try to get a competitive advantage. And if you do, you'll be punished. Like I have a real hard time seeing colleges and universities voluntarily going along with that, because they have not voluntarily gone along with it at any point over the last 80 years, essentially. It doesn't bode well for whatever is going to end up happening with this, but I guess we have to wait and see how it plays out in the marketplace. It seems unlikely at this stage.
I mean, the other thing that doesn't really connect with pro sports is, for the most part, pro sports has leadership at the top, the owners, where they're very static. They are there for a while, and they also don't move between like Herb Simon has owned the Pacers. It's very unlikely he's going to own the Bulls. Or Mark Cuban owns the Mavs. He's probably not going to also own the Magic, but presidents move. I was just Googling, like, the president of Illinois is now the president of Wisconsin, or sorry, of Washington. Like, presidents move from school to school. And that also throws a wrinkle in here, just how different it is in pro sports. I'm with you. I find it really hard to believe everyone's going to do this. And I think what could happen is a couple of schools might do it in good faith and then get jobbed and then be like, all right, we're done.
Right.
And then everyone will be like, look what happened to school X.
Yeah.
Like they tried to follow the rules. Everyone just piled on them and like, they're not going to do that.
And again, I mean, the whole history of the NCAA, I mean, Indiana getting a 4-year postseason ban in the late 50s, early 60s because of what happened in the late 50s in football. The injustice of that, as we've talked about before, is that they were doing nothing different than what Michigan and Ohio State were doing during that same time period. They got caught and they got heavily punished because the NCAA couldn't prove that Michigan and Ohio State were doing those things, but they absolutely were. And everybody in college football knew it. And SMU getting the death penalty for doing things that were no different than Texas and Texas A&M and Houston were doing. But because they were brazen about it, they get the death penalty. Like that's always been
every time Kentucky cheats, Northern Kentucky gets penalized.
Cleveland State. There is the old Jerry Tarkanian quote.
Yeah,
the NCAA is so mad at Kentucky that they just gave Cleveland State an extra year of probation. I mean, the problem has always been
always funny coming from Jerry Tarkanian, the white prince of, the guy who never cheats.
But I mean, but his point was, I'm not doing anything different than Kentucky is doing. I'm not doing anything different than UCLA did. I mean, it's the irony of the NCAA lifting John Wooden up as the ultimate avatar of all that was good with college sports. Meanwhile, he's rolling out teams that are being bankrolled by boosters at levels that nobody else in the country could match. Like that's how you win 10 titles in 12 years. The whole thing is built upon image, but the reality underneath the surface, once you pull the rocks up in the NCAA, has been there's an open market for player talent that you have to pay for, and the rules say you can't.
Right.
Like you can't just go about it saying, well, we're going to do this voluntarily, but there's not really a clear mechanism that would illustrate how they're going to handle it when it's not voluntary. It'll take the first major enforcement case, or it'll take something like Tennessee getting kicked out of the SEC, actually kicked out of the SEC.
That would be nuts.
And that's why it seems unlikely it's going to happen.
Right.
And that's the thing, as has been pointed out by several commentators on this front, that could end up undoing college sports altogether. Because if this just ends up in a complete free-for-all on top of the rev share, you're not going to have anything recognizable. You're going to have something that's more akin to what you see in European soccer, where you have a small tier of teams, 2 or 3 out of each league, that have the financial wherewithal to pay players significantly more than everybody else. And that's where all the talent congregates, and everybody else is essentially playing for second. And yeah, you could still get a random team winning the title or being in the final that isn't quite in that financial echelon, but it's exceedingly unlikely. And instead, the world is filled with championship wins from the Real Madrids and the Man Cities and the PSGs because they just spend more money than everybody else. That's the real danger in this, unless the enforcement actually has teeth, and unless you have a culture shift in college athletics that says everybody has to abide by this, there are no exceptions. That last part goes entirely counter to how college athletics has decided to run itself over the course of the last 80 years. That's the point.
Yeah.
The last couple of things I wanted to get to, they're a little smaller, I think, overall, but one of them is the roster limits issue. So the NCAA is increasing the number of maximum scholarships allowed in various sports, but they are also removing walk-ons from these sports. And so what you're going to have is a situation where you don't have to have as many, you don't have to give as many scholarships as the maximum number. But for instance, like football right now has a scholarship limit of 85, but essentially an unlimited number of walk-ons to go along with that. So you've got teams carrying 125 people on the roster, even if you can only have 85 on scholarship. That's going to be cut to 105 total. That's your roster limit. Men's basketball is at 15. Women's basketball is at 15. Men's and women's soccer will be at 28 if you choose to offer those sports. Softball at 25 and volleyball at 18. And there's a whole list of other ones as well. So that's a big question in terms of, does that help with the talent stockpiling, or does it hurt with the talent stockpiling? A lot of schools have said, well, we're not going to carry any more than the 85 that we're currently supposed to carry.
Could you just have a practice squad? Or, is there really a way to enforce?
No, I think the idea is, I do think there's competition and participation in practices is going to be the roster at the end of the day. So there is a way to enforce that. It's just going to be interesting because there's not really a great incentive for a lot of these teams to carry 105 people, because as we've seen, people leave, like in football, you can only effectively play about 32 to 35 people for major minutes in a given game. And we see players transferring all of the time. That the idea that you're just going to be able to carry a huge roster of the best players, that's not bearing out, because that ends up hurting the players. So I am curious what happens with movement there. But the other issue that's going to be interesting is in the non-revenue sports, a lot of the scholarship levels had been cut down. They were all partial scholarships and things like that. There's going to be effects there that we don't totally know. I think where the big issue is going to happen here is there's going to be a lot of sports that just are not offered anymore. And you're going to see a lot of athletic departments saying, well, we have to look at where the revenue's coming from. We're going to end up just offering football and men's basketball, and we'll have to offer some women's sports for Title IX purposes. But in terms of carrying, like Ohio State has 36 scholarship sports. Stanford has 48. Indiana's got 24. That's 9 more scholarship sports than most SEC schools offer. Most of the SEC schools only offer 15 scholarship sports. So the reason I bring all that up is there's a cost to benefit analysis to how many sports you're carrying, and it ties right into these roster limits. So it's kind of this interesting paradigm where we don't know what the effects are going to be, but that is something that now is introduced as a part of this settlement. So the last thing I wanted to hit on is the Title IX aspect. And this is something for a later podcast. So there's been a lot of threatening language from lawyers saying you're not going to be allowed to give essentially 85-90% of your rev share to male athletes. It has to be equally split male and female athletes. The thing that's going to be fascinating about this with the rev share argument is if you go back and look at what Title IX actually says. Title IX is about proportionality, and it's about access to opportunity. It's not about equality and compensation. And so this is a brand new vista where it's always been how many scholarships are you giving out, because that's the avatar for participation. Rev share is different. Rev share is not about participation. Rev share is about here's what your value is to the school. And whatever you want to argue about the educational benefits or the health benefits or the societal benefits of women's sports versus men's sports from a revenue perspective right now, they're on different planets, essentially. And that's even with women's basketball having made some significant strides in terms of a national broadcast deal, things like that. So I'm sure we'll see lawsuits on that front as well.
So what you're saying is like IU could still offer scholarships for women's soccer, be under Title IX, but it's like we're not offering them rev share. Because the Title IX is just about scholarships, and you have a team, you're just not going to get paid.
That's the big question, though. Will there be a ruling? Because the Department of Justice under the Biden administration made a lot of noise about, well, this would run afoul of Title IX. I'm not convinced that there's actually case law that indicates that's the case. And again, I think look at coach compensation. If there was really a rule about compensation in this sort of an instance, this is the question around student athletes. Are they classified so differently from professionals? Now that they're being paid like professionals, can't you look at what a women's basketball coach makes versus what a men's basketball coach makes and say, well, that's different there. Why is it somehow different with athletes? So that's a legal question that's going to have to be settled in the courts. It's going to be really fascinating to see how that plays out. But that's the other major element of this that I wanted to bring out. Obviously, there's a ton more in terms of implications and analysis. We're going to leave that for a future podcast because we really need to retrace the steps that got us here in the first place. So we'll do that later. But as we wrap up the NIL part of this pod, any final thoughts or questions you've got right now?
No, it seems pretty good. Seems pretty simple.
Yeah.
I'll ask you these two questions, and I think you'll probably dig deeper into these in later pods. But my question is, and you don't need to give me specific schools, but maybe like a type of school. Like seeing this, kind of your early reaction. Who do you think this helps, and who do you think this hurts?
I think ultimately, it helps athletes because whatever you want to say about how this is going to meter out. At the end of the day, schools are now going to be paying college athletes for playing sports, and it's legal, and it's a lot more of a just system when you consider the sheer amount of money coming into the college sports landscape than we've ever had before. So, I mean, the athletes moving forward, like now moving forward, are the big winners in this. And I don't think that should be undersold. Like, everybody's focusing on roster rules and NIL compensation, but at the core, you're going to have compensation for playing college sports. And I think that that's a good thing ultimately. I know there's people in the audience who disagree with that, but realistically speaking, it was an embarrassment that in college athletics, you somehow didn't have to pay the labor. And that somehow people had talked themselves into this idea that a free college education was compensation enough, when that was really just the get in the door price to have a top level athlete. It also, I think it's helpful in that it lays bare what the realities have been for years, which is that good athletes get paid money to go play in college. And everybody's known it. Now it's out there in the open. We can stop pretending that that's not happening. As far as like what schools are helped, I don't think we know yet. A lot of it's going to depend on the enforcement, because you can bet that the top schools in college sports, the ones with the biggest fan bases and the biggest donor bases, they are going to press every advantage, because the last thing they want is an actual level playing field. They don't want the NFL. They don't want it where anybody can build a team based upon the rules. They want like Major League Baseball. They want the Dodgers. They want to be the Mets are a bad example, but they want to be the team that can spend more than anybody else on the talent, hoard all the talent, and then go win titles. That's what it's all about at the end of the day. And so I am curious. I think schools that have chosen to throw their hat in the ring, those are the winners. I think the losers are going to be the people that don't want to throw their hat in the ring. And this is where, I know I was talking with Matt Blaska about this earlier, like there's big questions about Indiana State. Will they opt in or opt out? A lot of schools at that level, a lot of schools at the G5 level, there's a point of diminishing returns with this process. And it goes back to something we've talked about a bunch, which is, why do colleges and universities engage in college athletics? Fundamentally, they do it for marketing. They do it for alumni service. They do it to get their brand out there and get the type of advertising that you couldn't pay for without spending insane amounts of money. This is a deal in a lot of ways. But for the schools that are further down the food chain, it may not be worth participating in anymore, which is going to significantly harm those schools' ability to compete in revenue-generating sports. Unfortunately, the way the system was set up, the revenue-generating sports were already paying for everything else. So I think it will have a lot of knock-on effects down the line. So I think it hurts not just those schools and those fan bases, but it's also going to hurt the athletes that are in competition at that level, because there's a huge jump between that level and the power conference level. The flip side is, as bad as that will be for those folks that are associated with those types of schools, I think a lot of those schools and athletes were kind of being kept afloat at a level above where they should have been. If you look at the way that athletics works everywhere else in the world, like this, college athletics has basically existed in this almost suspended animation up to this point. And I think at some point that had to stop. What that turns into is an open question. You can either be doom and gloom and saying it's going to be like a 15 to 20 team super conference and everybody else is screwed. You can take the moderate view and say, it's actually going to be closer to 50 or 60 teams, and it's going to be a much more national sort of environment. I don't know exactly where it's going to go. I think that's the open question. And of course, the number one winner in all of this, Scott, more than anybody else, more than the athletes, lawyers. Yes, yeah. Lawyers are the big winners.
This is going to be my last comment is just kind of a get off my lawn thing, and it probably won't happen, but it's just shouting it out loud. But back to something you had said months ago in a podcast about, I think you would use Matt Painter as your example, which I'm fine going on him. But just, I really hope this does change the paradigm of the way the universities and the media partners view the student athletes as partners. And we can all stop talking about the good old days when players just didn't take money and, why are they getting paid? And it is coaches and the media just harp on this and complain about it and talk about how bad this is and how it's going to ruin the sport. It's like, stop. But I mean, you get this at times in pro sports, normally around a lockout. Like there's an NBA lockout, and then for a year, it's like, man, I can't believe you guys are getting paid this much. And then now it's just more like, man, I can't believe Karl-Anthony Towns makes $60 million because of so much of the cap. It's not about like caring about how much they make. We understand they're players; they get paid, and they get paid a very good amount because they've agreed to that. So do the teams. There's big money in all of this. I just wish that now we can stop having the own coaches and media of these organizations actively undercutting players at all times, because it to me, it just sows the seeds for a very toxic area where you're dealing with 18, 19, 20-year-old, they are athletes. They are, quasi professionals, but they are still, some of them not of legal drinking age. They are still maturing. They're still very young in life. And it is just very tough to think that you're now going to basically just say, well, that guy's the exact same as an NBA pro. It's like, no, they are not. And they shouldn't be treated, you shouldn't bring all your vile and be like, well, because they're getting paid now, I can do whatever I want as a fan. I hope we can bring down some of that and just stop this anger we have toward college athletes getting paid, because it's being propagated by mostly the infrastructure that they work within.
Look, people don't like to hear this, but coaches, particularly Gen X coaches, like coaches who are kind of in this intermediate generation, and athletic directors, and this is not every coach and not every athletic director, they have a significant amount of burden on their hands in terms of what they have done to poison the attitudes towards college athletes around something that should have been a legally guaranteed right, that was artificially extended by a misapplication of a court decision that happened in 1984. The amount of vitriol that flows about college athletics being ruined because there's player compensation is largely sour grapes from a group of people who's both bitter that they didn't get compensated themselves because they worked in a previous era, and who don't want to adapt to an era where we recognize the real value that college athletes have in the marketplace. And I'm not going to, in this podcast, go through the entire litany of things that led us to this point, and all of the bad faith arguments that happened over time about college athletes not having any intrinsic market value, about, nobody's going to go to games if we pay players. Like, every single point has been proven demonstrably false. And and then you add gambling, sports gambling and sports wagering to the mix, which was agreed to with open arms by college athletic conferences. So many things have been done on behalf of the people who should be the custodians of not just the sport, but the reputation of the players, to actively damage the players because it is a financial inconvenience that they won't be able to keep all of the money at the athletic department and coach level. And again, this is not every athletic department. It's not every coach. And I think, as we've seen, older coaches and younger coaches over 60 and under 40, seem to be adapting just fine to the new realities. Right. But at some point, we got to stop pining for the good old days, because the good old days weren't all that good, and they didn't make a lot of sense, and they wouldn't have passed legal muster. Let's just embrace that and move forward with this new reality would be my biggest hope. I don't think we're actually going to have that happen, because it's too easy. And this is where we're going to get one last gasp of sports columnists decrying the system and talking about the real amateurs at the Division III level. And I hope that they go. I would love to see nothing more than all of those sports columnists sitting in the press box at Rose-Hulman with me, broadcasting Division III football games. I don't see them there, much as they pine for that era and that sort of college sports. I'm not seeing those columnists. I'm not seeing, these coaches going out and voluntarily coaching at the D3 level. Like, so if you're the type of coach who likes to complain about these things, there's 800 Division III schools. Go coach at one of those on a volunteer basis and tell me how you like it. So anyway,
agreed 100%.
So we got a lot more to talk about with all of this. And look, again, there are I guess the last thing I'll say, and it kind of ties to that point. Stop looking at college athletes as adversaries. If you're coaches, if you're athletic directors, they are partners. They have to be partners in this. And there has to be a partnership. This cannot be, you're costing us money, we're going to make life miserable for you, either directly or indirectly. That has got to change. And that's leadership. That is the type of leadership that you have to have out of, especially if you're going to claim to be an education or an institution of higher education. Like, there's got to be a higher standard of behavior on that front. Yeah. Whatever you want to talk about, this was a settlement the NCAA pushed for, the conferences pushed for, it's been approved. Money's going to be there. Why doesn't everybody try this system and see if it works and do it in good faith and stop blaming athletes for trying to get what, and it's not even what I would argue a fair share, because if you look at professional sports,
it's less.
It's less by half percentage wise in most cases. So anyway, let's stop there. We're going to do more on NIL coming up in the future, and the clearinghouse and everything else, and we'll watch as this evolves, and we'll hopefully have some guests on to talk through things. But
you could literally have a class just on this.
Yes, we've had a class.
Okay.
I'm going to do another class probably on it at some point soon. Okay. But again, it changes so quickly. You have to update the materials all the time, and that is a bit of an issue with a class where you like to have some consistency. Great topics course, though, certainly.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's quickly talk Indiana Pacers. Scott, the game one was, again, one of those games where it just defied any logical explanation or sense of anything. Like it was one of those those games that when you look at the box score, there's zero rationale for saying, hey, the Pacers won this game. They get out turnovered in the game. I think, 25-6. They were clearly visually the inferior team for about 40 of the 48 minutes of the game. They didn't get great experience or great performances out of really anybody. They got some good performances. Pascal Siakam played well. Tyrese Halliburton closed really well. You got some good performances off the bench from Obi Toppin and Thomas Bryant. But realistically speaking, it was a game the Pacers shouldn't have won, and yet it ends in a very spookily similar fashion to what we saw in the last three series, capped off by Tyrese Halliburton, who had not had a great night from a shooting perspective, hitting a drifting long two from the right side with 0.3 of a second left. The Pacers only lead for that 0.3 of a second, but they come out of that first game leading 1-0. You and I spent like 25 minutes on the phone after this game ended just trying to talk it out. I wish we just recorded that conversation because it was just goofy how giddy and how unbelievable the whole thing felt at the time. Your reflections from that game and how you processed it all and how you're processing it now.
I'm still kind of stunned. I mean, the thing that I walked away from is like, this is happening in the fact that you're having one of these in every single series is wild. You know, we grew up in the Reggie era where like he had those games against the Knicks, but like there was also a series, there's a series against the Magic before that where nothing happened. But I mean, literally every series you have one of these wild comebacks, and at the center of it is Tyrese Halliburton making a shot, either making a drive, making a step back, in this case, just stopping on a dime and making a shot. And in the Bucks case, you ended a series with it. In the Cavs and the Knicks case, and in this case, you walk in and you take a game that should have been a loss. And how teams react to that, we're going to see. I think the Thunder they're a really good team. I'll say this, the Thunder, I'm not sure they can play much better in the first half. The Pacers can definitely play better, but there's a long history when you go back and see games that, you own spike a game and you just lose a game like this in pretty rough fashion. The Thunder have this saying of, get back to zero, just always get back to zero and just go from there. But it's tough. And it's tough to be like, man, we got to win 5 of 7 now because we just lost one that we should have won. And more often than not, that ends up being the defining factor in that series where it's like that team just could not get over the fact that they basically punted a game away that they should have won.
I mean, there's a lot of different aspects of this that are hard to tell what the long-term ramifications are. And so first of all, everything you said, yes, the Thunder should have won the game. Looked like they were going to win the game, like literally right up to the last second. That wasn't even a particularly great shot that Tyrese Halliburton took. A drifting 22-footer that didn't go straight in, like it rattled in. It wasn't a completely pure shot. How do you recover from that? It's a young team. This is not the first time they've been tested like this. They were down 2-1 to Denver in the second round. They got destroyed in game 3 by Minnesota in the Western Conference Finals. They rallied in both of those cases. They come back, they get better play, they win 3 out of the next 4 games in the Denver series and ended up clinching it in the 7th game. They came back and beat Minnesota in game 4. So they've dealt with these kinds of things before. I don't expect them to fold mentally. And I think as a Pacers fan, you can be really giddy about what happened. You can look and say, well, gosh, the Pacers didn't even play particularly well. between the turnovers and what kept them alive in this game was the 3-point shooting. They shoot 46% from three. I think they were 18 of 39 from three in the game. That's sustainable. Like, they could hit that from three, and Oklahoma City is not thus far look like that they're going to really adapt. That's how they lost the Dallas series last year, was corner threes and just a really high percentage of threes being hit by the Mavs. But, you look at this from the Pacers perspective and you say, we can play better. But I think you also have to look at it and say, Oklahoma City is capable and normally does, buzzsaw you at some point in the game. Somehow the Pacers managing to keep that to about a 12 to 15 point deficit despite all the turnovers and the turnover differential. It's laudable, but it's not like Oklahoma City's just going to lose every game the rest of the way here. Like, they're going to come back strong. And I'm really curious to see, okay, can the Pacers get better, more sustained play? What does that look like? It's not too dissimilar, though, Scott, to how I felt coming out of game one in the Knicks series, where the Pacers did not play well in that first game. They had that crazy comeback. They had that insane shot that sends them to overtime. They win the game. And I just assumed that they were going to go into game two and the Knicks were going to be all fired up and they were going to win. And then that's not what happened. Pacers end up winning game two as well. They gave away a little bit of that advantage by losing game three at home. But it is a really interesting psychological spot for both teams to be in. And I think all it's done for me is say this is going to be a 6 or 7 game series. Yeah. But I felt that before, and I really felt like the Pacers were being undersold. The way that they won the game wasn't just the 3-pointers, but as was pointed out on a couple of podcasts, the fact that they turned the ball over 24 times and only allowed 11 points off of turnovers, is that sustainable? Like, if they can do that and they can make it so that the turnovers aren't as harmful even when they do happen, well, now I really like their chances even more. But for the Pacers to win, I think what we've seen now is that they don't have to play a complete perfect game in order to win. They can play a game where they've got a decent, they're doing decently, but not awesome the whole game through. I'm just curious how Oklahoma City responds. Do they go back to their 2 big lineup? Do they, they're going to
2 big lineup? And I'll say with that, this is where I think Oklahoma City's got some questions to answer, because Chet Holmgren did not play much in that game. He didn't play down the stretch. His defensive superpower is being at the rim and stopping, being the rim defender. They don't really know where to put him, because you put him on Miles Turner, and Miles Turner is going to pick him pop and pull him out. And so you don't want that. You can put him on Siakam, but Siakam can pull him out. Siakam can also get a little gamey down there. I'm not saying they're playing him off the court, but it does, it's not quite sure where Holmgren fits in. The Thunder were not a great shooting team throughout the year. They put up a lot of points, a lot of them in transition. They don't shoot threes really well. And then I look at it that, to me, the Pacers are doing something similar they did to Cleveland. They did the Knicks. In Cleveland, they just kind of let Donovan Mitchell go nuts. They let Giannis go nuts in the Bucks series. They kind of, they had a hard time with Cap, but they would, try to funnel a lot to Brunson. They're doing the same thing here. They're pushing it all to SGA. And I got to say, man, to me, the MVP was Nembhard. His defense on SGA. And you go back, this is a guy, they played together in Canada. He knows him. And I wonder, with the way that, Nembhard kind of figured out Brunson as the series went on, this was much different, where Nembhard just came in and immediately went at him. And if you notice, there was everyone talks about the play where they kind of bump shoulders, and then, SGA shoves them, and they got a little bit like SGA is like the Iceman, like never shows emotion. Nembhard kind of smiled, got into his head. The very next time, Nembhard just brought the ball up, did his dribble, did a step back, popped a 3 right in SGA's face. And I think there might be a little bit of gamesmanship where it's like, I'm going to go just punch the bully in the face right away. And Nembhard's just like, hey, man, I know how to defend you. Like, I know how to play you. I know how to defend you. What are you guys going to do about it?
Yeah, well, and
the last thing I'll say is, in that end of the fourth quarter, sometimes Halliburton gets talked about for being a little bit passive. I don't think he was doing that in the fourth quarter. You saw him giving the ball to Nembhard because they had Dort playing Halliburton so tight. What Halliburton did, in my mind, was really smart. He just stepped out, and it's like, okay, we are now going to actively take your best defender out of the game, because Dort's going to be face guarding Halliburton. Great. because we have a secondary ball handler. We trust our second guys. So now we're going to play 4-on-4. But guess what, Thunder? You don't have your best defender playing.
Yeah. No, I mean, and they've done that before on things. And no, it's in game 6, Nembhard got under Brunson's skin so badly that Brunson headbutted him at midcourt. Of course, it wasn't called because, God forbid, officials do their jobs in the NBA. But he can be very annoying. Now, SGA he scored 38 points, but took how many shots did he take?
14 of 30.
I mean, that's a lot of shots. And this is the issue you run into if the Pacers and let SGA punch himself out while limiting the involvement of other people. I mean, Chet Holmgren only playing 23 minutes is a big head scratcher in a lot of ways. But it also, as I heard Zach Lowe point out, Turner's a real weird defensive matchup for Holmgren because Holmgren thrives right next to the basket, altering shots. He can't do that if he has to hang out with Miles Turner on the wing the whole time. So there's a lot of cool things. And I think the thing I enjoyed the most about that game was the internal chess matches that were going on that the Pacers were engaging in strategically in terms of who they had on the floor, how they were working things, how they adjusted as the game went along. If you don't think that there's strategy in the NBA, or you don't think that there's a lot of cool stuff basketball-wise going on behind the scenes, just really, this is the series, I think, where this might disprove your theory.
Yeah.
And that's exciting. And I'm just excited that it's, that the pundits were wrong, that this wasn't just a dog walking by Oklahoma City from start to finish. We'll see. It's a long series. We've seen teams come out, win game 1, and then wash out in the next 4 games. It's nothing's given. It's just, you gotta, if you're a Pacers fan, just another brick in the wall of how lovable and enjoyable this team is to follow, I think, is the big take home for me.
I got one more big picture take home before we move on from the game. Just I thought, and Brian Windhorst talked about this after the game on SVP, but you look at the last play. Halliburton has the ball. They don't call timeout, which I love, but he goes right. He kind of dribbles. He goes right. They just let him go right the entire time. He has Cason Wallace on him. Caruso is there, doesn't flash him. And the thing that I look back, it's like, where's Dort? Like, Dort is your best defender. You should just immediately be like, Dort, get on the ball. Like, get on the ball. He's not there. But this goes to what Windhorst was talking about, is that you saw at the beginning of the game, you can't replicate what the Thunder do on defense. And so when you see it for the first time, it's like, oh my God, like there's guys everywhere. It's just arms, and the Pacers were rattled. No question about it. But on the flip side, you can't replicate what it's like being walked down by the Pacers and just having them walk you down to a loss. And the Thunder were rattled by that. Like that last play to me is a perfect example. Like Lou Dort is on the other side of the court. I think he's guarding like Neesmith just in the corner, but like the ball's not going there. You should go get on Halliburton. Halliburton's taking the shot. They messed up those defensive assignments. And, again, it's like the Thunder have to show they can get away. They can figure this out, because now what you've done, it's funny. It's like, you're the Thunder. You saw it happened to the Cavs. It happened to the Knicks. Like, we saw that movie. It's not going to happen to us. Now it happened to you. And so now, like, you're down 20. You're up by 20 in game 2 with 3 minutes to go. You're like, where's the shark? Like, where's Jaws? Like, it's coming.
Well, that's the thing. There are things the Thunder can do to adapt. And so I wouldn't panic if I was them. And I think they can say, look, we lost on a fluke set of circumstances. Now, they may not actually have, but I think they can say that to themselves. So, look, this is where these things are supposed to be fun. And this is where as we've talked about with the Pacers on a couple of occasions now, and with some other things that have happened in sports lately, one of the great things about sports is that you can't say for sure what's going to happen, even if it seems like you can say for sure what's going to happen. And I'm really fascinated to see what happens in game 2, because I don't think the Pacers, as we saw in the Knicks series, they're not going to be satisfied with saying, hey, we got one, we're going to go home and just settle it at home. I think they're going to come out with a lot of adaptations, and Oklahoma City's going to have to adjust on the fly. But, Pacers still have to do that with OKC as well, like the other direction.
So I know the Colts won the Super Bowl. So I'm aware of that. But, and they dispatched the Patriots in that run, which was pretty cool. The Pacers beat the Bucks, who are their kind of current rival. Right. They beat the Knicks, which is kind of their historical playoff rival. 4 amazing late game winners in 4 different rounds, one in the finals. Is this the best run of an Indiana sports team?
I got to think about that. Well,
Yeah.
let's talk about that on the next podcast. I will say, if they beat Oklahoma City, I saw a stat the other day, then it would become the most difficult path to a finals, to a title, I think, in the history of the finals is the stat I saw. I got to dig that up and find it, but it's at that level if you think about the relative quality of the teams the Pacers have gone through. So anyway,
no, but I think at this point, first off, just enjoy. I was thinking about this. Just enjoy it. Like, just enjoy the ride. It's fun. But I think they're in a really good. I mean, obviously, they're in a great position. You know, you don't want to look at it this way. I think they're going to get greedy and try and go for it. You want to win the home games, but I really look at it like if you can get one of the next three.
Yeah.
If you would have told me at the start of the series it's going to be 2-2 going back to OKC in Game 5, like done, take it right now.
Yeah.
You know, but if you can, this is where I keep saying this over and over again, and the Pacers keep doing it. You know, in Game 5 against Cleveland, in Game 2 against New York. All I said was like, just keep those games close. Because if you keep them close, the teams are going to get tight. The fans are going to get tight. And like the Thunder will be like, my God, are we about to go down 0-2 at home to a plus 700 favorite? Like, what are we doing here? And they're going to get tight. And you saw it happen. And so I think that's the key thing is you just can't get blitzed out.
Yeah. We got a lot more to talk about with both this series and the NIL stuff. So we will do that as we move forward. But thanks to all of you for listening. And we'll keep a finger on the pulse of both as we move into this next week and beyond. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. Thanks for following along with us here during the summer. We'll be back with more podcast action relatively soon. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Still working on the tagline, folks. We're going to figure it out as we move forward. Anyway, we'll catch you folks on the flip side. Have a good one.